Hi, this is Denise Stanley from California State University, Fullerton. And in this section, we're going to be looking at the most famous free trade agreement in Latin America, which actually was including investment provisions, and how it's worked out generally across time and expanded to Central America. Now, this was signed in 1994, and it was supposed to be rolled out over 15 years, not immediate trade liberalization. It was set up to have tariffs reduced among the member countries only, no external tariffs, but just Mexico would reduce its tariffs on products coming from the United States would reduce its tariffs on products coming from Mexico, and also with Canada. And it was rolled out with manufacturing goods having their tariffs reduced first, and then agricultural groups' tariffs going slower because of more adjustments needed there. Now, the other thing that's unique is this expanded the whole language to include investment provisions and giving the nation's most favored nation status. So this means that any sort of investment rules that a country offers to another has to be offered to these members of this agreement. So if the United States has special privileges, it lets Swiss investors come to the United States to invest in. All investors from Mexico wanting to go to the United States could enjoy those. For instance, if a business license cost $100, for any U.S. Business startup, any Mexican investor should be able to go in and pay $100 for the same business license. Now, it had a third thing that was quite well known for trying to promote investment and investment security, and that was the Chapter 11 provision. Now, this allows individual firms who feel like something has gone wrong in their transactions in a country to sue, in the sense that they might get monetary compensation from a nation if a arbitration, which is binding, finds that the member country did things wrong against the company. So for instance, if a company feels that they were supposed to get tax rebates or different treatment at customs and they were charged too much, and the local agency in the country, for instance, in the United States, would not pay the Mexican investor enough, the Mexican investor could take this complaint to this outside arbitration and demand money from the U.S. government. It was also controversial in the sense that if a country's domestic laws were seen as hurting business in some way, in a different way than the home country, the whole law could be put up for dispute. If a particular local environmental legislation was causing a foreign investor to have business problems, then that local environmental provision could be subject to scrutiny by the arbitration. The other thing that happened with this agreement that was famous was the side deals on environmental labor. These were necessary to get the votes in Congress to have it pass. There was concern about U.S. job loss from NAFTA if there weren't unionized workers in Mexico and there were bad environmental conditions undercutting production costs. It was seen that the United States was going to lose a lot by letting a cheaper country get involved in a trade agreement. So these side agreements came along, the North American Agreement on Labor Cooperation and the Commission for Environmental Cooperation were the organizations who were supposed to monitor the side agreements. And basically, the side agreements were a pledge that each country would uphold its own national laws and have those in force for any company that would operate in the other part of the trade agreement. So if a U.S. company went to Mexico, the Mexican government would enforce its labor laws in that setting and enforce its labor laws in its environmental laws in that setting. That does not mean that all the member countries were going to have the same wage rate, or all the member countries were going to have the same environmental law, parts per million pollution or something. It meant that each country would enforce its own domestic laws. And there was follow-up in cases to see if that was happening when there was disputes. Now, how do we evaluate this? Looking mainly from the Mexico point of view, since Mexico was the one who could be most changed by NAFTA. Looking back, definitely there was an expansion of exports from Mexico, maquiladoras, assembly plants, auto products, all sorts of things, more exports from Mexico to the United States and Canada. Regarding the other sectors, agriculture, it was mixed, and there was exports of fruit from Mexico to the U.S. and Canada that grew quite a bit. However, regarding corn and basic grains, they had a lot of cheap imports coming into Mexico, and this particularly hurt southern Mexico. And the argument was that agriculture is subsidized in the United States, so there's cheaper corn. The unit costs are cheaper because of subsidies, and that would hurt small farmers in Mexico. Now, keep in mind that in the United States, there was a special provision under the U.S. Department of Labor called trade adjustment assistance, transitional trade adjustment assistance, and funding for U.S. workers who were hurt by imports. That did not exist in Mexico, so this led to quite a bit of concern in Mexico among the agricultural sector workers. Now, overall, though, Mexico was seen as gaining as a nation, particularly domestic urban consumers, because there were cheaper imports from lower tariffs or zero tariffs. And at the end of this, one would say for Mexico, there was an overall trade gain. Generally, Mexico started to run a trade surplus with the United States, more exports than imports, an increase in exports that was greater than the increase in imports. And there was trade creation in the sense that most of this was efficient because it was that imports were coming from a cheap, efficient partner, the United States. And it was seen as a better way to have a regional trade agreement in this sense. Now, generally over time, this has evened out a bit, but in the initial parts, the Mexican exports were growing greatly to the United States, so that the trade surplus was clear. And the trade surplus has decreased in recent years, but it was setting the stage to continue. Now, the side agreements, what can be said about those? In summary, the issue was that the organizations were not funded well enough to really monitor and allow unions to operate. Environmental enforcement, there was not enough cooperation with the domestic agencies in these areas, and there was more of an emphasis on the labor side and more attention because of labor abuses reported in the press, whereas in the environmental monitoring just didn't really advance under this. And there were investor disputes. Basically, by about the year 2010, about 20 disputes brought up by each country against each country. For instance, Mexican and U.S. investors were complaining about their treatment in Canada and brought up disputes in that sense, many of these for tax rebates. And it was pretty balanced. Most of the cases were very slow and settled out of arbitration, and only a few of them were successful, less than half for each of the country's investors who were making the complaints. Now, this continued, and it was still fairly unpopular in Mexico, among many people in southern Mexico in particular, but it's 15 years, and it was renewed. Recently in the last year, actually, there was a new agreement, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which is an expansion of NAFTA for another 15 years, using the same basic language, but tweaking a bit to make it a bit more favorable for the United States, actually. And it requires that there are more parts of cars that have a local content within the region. So 75% of all car parts now must be made across Canada, Mexico, and the United States for it to qualify for the entering duty-free tariff provisions. And there are requirements about higher wages in Mexican factories and union creation. And there is now be given more funding for the environmental protection and trademarks. The very controversial dispute settlement is gone, and it was a very popular agreement. It was signed in this point by all three countries with very little dispute, very little outcry in any Congress. Now, since Mexico had been doing this for a while, Central America was really quite interested in forming CAFTA and eventually expanded it to the Dominican Republic for CAFTA-DR. And it basically followed the NAFTA agreement almost word for word. However, it didn't allow trade with Mexico. CAFTA is meant as an agreement between Central American countries and the United States. So it doesn't open up trade and free tariffs, trade liberalization between, say, Nicaragua and Mexico, but between Nicaragua and the United States. and Canada hasn't been involved in this as much. And it's basically building on historical relations between Central America, the Dominican Republic, and the United States, political relations, and the need to have trade in those countries for economic growth. And again, duty-free access, reduction of tariffs. There were other treaties that were going to expire, and it is continuing to have agricultural products, fruits coming from Central America, and corn and wheat going from the United States. This has been delayed a bit, but the goal was to do this all within the 15-year span again, and the same side agreements. Now, it's hard to evaluate at this point, but it is important to remember that this was very controversial, but it was very strongly pushed by business leaders, so it got through. It was controversial in the United States and in Costa Rica in particular. In the United States, for instance, it was a very close vote, and the California senators split with 1 for and 1 against CAFTA. Costa Rica, it passed by 1 vote, and but it was seen that Central America is going to have major problems and wouldn't be able to sell its exports if they didn't have CAFTA. And it's in the context also that Central America had a common market that was not doing too well and had a lot of trade diversion, and it was supporting Costa Rica and El Salvador and not really bringing up Nicaragua and Honduras. And part of the issue is a small country common market had too much trade diversion. So hopefully by having a large country, efficient country in it, you could have more trade creation. And this whole region had a history of lower tariffs with the United States from the Caribbean Basin Initiative and the geopolitical context of the 1980s. So CAFTA went through, it's in process, and it will likely be renewed, as was the agreement of NAFTA.